Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Irsa Karina Madasari from English Department, Morning Class, University of Pekalongan. In this opportunity, I'd like to represent the material of interpreting in education. Since the last presentation, me and my group made a mistake. We didn't read the whole instruction, so we missed the information about the book that being a search. So we really sorry about that, and we like to fulfill this presentation redemption. So this material tell us about interpreters that work in educational setting. They work in primary, secondary, and post-secondary schools to interpret between students, staff, faculty, administrator, parents, or other stakeholders. For spoken language interpreters, the most common form of interpreting in these venues is between parents who do not speak the language of the school and teachers or other staff. Meanwhile, sign language interpreters frequently work full-time in educational settings as they interpret for students throughout their daily activities. Other sign language interpreters interpret between deaf teacher and hearing parents and school personnel, perhaps interpreting class content into spoken English, or interpreting meetings or even school-wide events. Interpreters might also work in vocational trainings or adult education classes. So, in this material, you will see that it mostly deals with deaf or hard hearing students, or it can be deaf teachers. Also, in this capture, you can learn the history of interpreting in education. Let's start with educational interpreter training and qualification. As a result of legislation, supply and demand, and public perception, interpreters working in public schools in the US have historically been underqualified and be underprepared, so that in fact many people hired to interpret in schools have not yet mastered their working languages. As the effects of legislation in 1991 and in response to a need for evaluations designed to assess interpreting skills of individuals working with students in school settings, Boys Town National Research Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska, designed and piloted the assessment instrument called the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessments. Currently, at least 29 U.S. states use the EIPA to meet state qualification standard for educational sign language interpreters working in primary and secondary settings. According to the EIPA website, candidates who take this assessment are rated on grammatical skills, it is use of prosody or intonation, grammar and space. The second is sign to voice interpreting skills. It is ability to understand and convey child or teen sign language. And the next is vocabulary. It is ability to use a wide range of vocabulary, accurate use of finger spellings and numbers. And the last is overall abilities. It is ability to represent a sense of the entire message, use appropriate discourse structures, and represent who is speaking. Next is about specialization, skills, and training. There are few opportunities to specialize as an interpreter in educational context. In fact, a web search reveals only one or two university programs for spoken language and a handful for sign language interpreting focus on working in educational settings. Other colleges may offer a course or dedicate some class time to preparing students for work in educational contexts. But there is no identifiable curriculum designed to teach this particular specialization. Complicating matters further, not all educators in interpreting programs have backgrounds in educational interpreting themselves. So, they may not be able to address the critical information about the teaching and learning context that the educational interpreters need to know to ensure school success for students who are dual language learners. So, it is important for interpreters to understanding dual language learners and primary language experiences. For these reasons, it is crucial for interpreters working with very young deaf and hard of hearing children to be extremely proficient in their working languages and to model both social and academic language in a way that is accessible to these children. Because interpreters are often the most proficient language models with whom these children consistently interact in school settings. The most highly qualified interpreters should be recruited to work with language deprived or delayed students. Furthermore, little is known about how academic and discourse norms must be adjusted to include a third party who mediates communication, especially when the third party interpreter is not a native of the language used to access discourse. In this case, American Sign Language or other form of sign language. There is also roles and responsibilities of educational interpreters. Role confusion is a particular source of frustration for many interpreters in educational settings, especially when the range of role students with the interpreter's primary obligation of interpreting or preparing to interpret. The time delay interpreters need to process the incoming message could very well cause students who need to wait for an interpretation before they can answer to come the unfortunate conclusion that there is no point in trying to answer a question because by the time they can answer, the class has already moved on. Students also reported that since it was difficult for the interpreters to keep up, often the hearing students were able to answer before the deaf students were presented with the interpreted question. Research specific to interpreting clearly demonstrates that skills beyond that of merely interpreting between two languages are required. But the field has made little progress in defining clearly what educational interpreters should be able to do and what set circumstances they are likely to encounter. In conclusion, implication for future research, Taylor suggests that when hiring educational interpreters, administrators should assess an interpreter's skills, expertise, knowledge of the subject matters, and ability to suit the needs of the situation and the individual child. Since deaf and hard of hearing students may not have had exposure to the same linguistic and culture capital and fun of knowledge as their hearing classmates. Scholars in the field of interpreter education have not reached consensus about the role of educational interpreters in consideration of learning, language, and social emotional needs of deaf and hard of hearing children in mainstream educational environments because of the impact that interpreters likely have on student language and school experiences, there is a pressing need for research on the work of educational interpreters, particularly in primary school settings or in all instances in which deaf or hard of hearing students or immigrant students may not yet have developed a solid language foundation in any language. That's all. So this material, like what I said before, it mostly deals with interpreting for deaf and hard hearing students, or it can be deaf teacher, but it also can be found in multinational school which use English as the first language to communication exposure. And we can see from the explanation, from the historical, that interpreting educational is still needs the improvement to about the skill of the interpreter itself. So I think that's all from me. Thank you for the attention and the opportunity. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.